A sun bled across the Arizona horizon, painting the stark, beautiful land in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. For Forrest, this was the hour of benediction, the time of day when the land sighed and settled, and a man could almost believe that peace was a tangible thing, something he could hold in his hands like a smooth river stone. He had come to this corner of the world seeking just that, a quiet untangling of the knots that the war and the bitter years after had tied inside him. His small ranch was modest, little more than a sturdy cabin, a barn, and a few acres of fenced-in pasture carved out of the wilderness. It was enough. It was more than enough. Here, the only ghosts were the whispering winds in the canyons and the memories he carried, and he was slowly learning to live with both. Stripped to the waist, the day's labor etched in sweat and dust on his skin, Forrest made his way to the creek that bordered his property. It was a lifeline, a silver ribbon that cut through the ochre-colored earth, its banks shaded by ancient cottonwoods whose leaves trembled with secrets. This was his ritual, not just a cleansing of the body, but a washing of the soul. He left his worn leather boots and trousers on a flat, sun-warmed rock, his muscles aching with the good, honest fatigue of mending fences and tending to his small herd of cattle. The water was shockingly cold, a jolt that stole his breath and cleared his mind. He sluiced over his shoulders, broad and scarred from a life that had demanded more than its fair share of him. He ran a hand through his thick, dark brown hair, letting the current pull the day's grime away. He closed his eyes, the water rising to his chest, the sound of its gentle rush, the only thing in the world. Here he wasn't a former soldier, not a man who had seen the worst of his countrymen. He was just a man standing in a creek, under a sky vast enough to hold all his regrets. It was a flicker of movement in the brush on the opposite bank that broke the spell. Instinct, honed on battlefields and hardened by years of caution, seized him. His body went rigid, every muscle tensing. His first thought was of a mountain lion, or perhaps a stray coyote. He slowly turned his head, his blue eyes, usually calm as a summer sky, narrowing into chips of ice. He scanned the dense foliage, the long shadows of dusk already creeping between the trees. And then he saw her. She was not a cougar, nor a coyote. She was a woman, an Apache woman. She stood half-concealed by the trunk of a juniper tree, as still and silent as the stone beside her. She wore a simple, sleeveless doeskin dress, its surface soft by wear and adorned with subtle beadwork that caught the last rays of the dying sun. Her black hair was long and unbound, a stark contrast to her coppery skin, but it was her eyes that held him captive. They were dark, deep, and impossibly clear, and they were fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. Forrest's heart hammered against his ribs. The rules of this land were unwritten but absolute. An unarmed white man, naked in a creek, and an Apache woman on the opposite bank. This was a recipe for bloodshed. He was trespassing on a memory, on a history that was not his, and she was the guardian of that frontier. He expected her to melt back into the shadows, to vanish as quickly as she had appeared, perhaps to return with warriors. He expected fear, or anger, or threat. He expected anything but what she did next. Her gaze never left his. There was no fear in it, only a profound, searching curiosity. It was the look of a naturalist observing a strange new creature in its habitat. Her head tilted slightly, a gesture of pure, unadulterated inquiry. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that defied every expectation in Forrest's mind, she stepped out from behind the tree. Forrest remained frozen, the cold of the water seeping into his bones, though he no longer felt it. He watched as she moved to the edge of the bank, her moccasined feet making no sound on the dry earth. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps in her early 20s, Her face was a study in serene strength, with high cheekbones and a firm, unsmiling mouth. He braced himself. This was it. A challenge. A warning. Instead of raising a weapon or a cry, she simply lowered herself to the ground, tucking her legs beneath her. She sat on the grassy bank, not 10 yards from him, and calmly folded her hands in her lap, and she watched. The sheer audacity of the act was staggering. It shattered every preconceived notion he held. It was not an act of aggression, nor was it one of submission. It was an act of presence. She was claiming her right to be there, to see him, as surely as the hawk claimed the sky. The power dynamic he had instinctively assumed, the vulnerable man, the hidden threat, was turned on its head. In her stillness, in her direct and unwavering gaze, she held all the power. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The crickets began their evening chorus, and a lone hawk circled high overhead, its cry a mournful sound in the vast quiet. Forrest stood motionless in the water, the initial shock giving way to a strange sense of wonder. He was being seen, truly seen, in a way he hadn't been in years. Stripped of his clothes, his tools, his past, he was just a man, and she was just a woman. Two people from different worlds, suspended in a moment of silent, impossible connection. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet pride in her posture. He saw a strength that was woven from the land itself. He wondered what she saw in him. Did she see an intruder, an enemy? Or did she see the weariness in his shoulders or the old pain that sometimes flickered in his eyes? Did she see the man who sought solace in the cold embrace of the creek? Slowly, deliberately, so as not to spook a wild and beautiful creature, Forrest moved. He bent down, scooped water into his hands, and splashed it over his face, continuing his bath. It was the only thing he could think to do. To flee would be to show fear. To shout would be to show aggression. To simply continue his ritual was a strange kind of acknowledgement, a message that said, I am not a threat. I am just here. He could feel her eyes on him, tracking his every movement. He washed the dust from his arms, his chest. The act, once private and solitary, was now a shared experience, an unspoken dialogue. The setting sun cast his long shadow across the water, the light catching the droplets as they ran down his skin. When he finally finished, he waded slowly toward the bank where his clothes lay. He did not turn his back to her. He moved sideways, his eyes never leaving hers. He half expected her to be gone when he reached the shore, to have disappeared back into the forest like a dream. But she remained, a silent sentinel on the opposite bank. He pulled on his trousers, his fingers fumbling slightly. He felt an odd, compelling need to say something, to bridge the immense silence between them. But what words were there? English would be a harsh, alien sound in this sacred quiet. He knew no Apache, so he did the only thing he could. He stood by the water's edge, his shirt still slung over his shoulder, and he met her gaze one last time. He gave a slow, small nod. It was a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, of something he didn't yet have a name for. For a long moment she did not respond. Then, just as the last sliver of sun vanished behind the mountains, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in return. And then, with the same fluid grace with which she had appeared, she rose to her feet. She turned and walked back into the twilight woods, not with haste, but with a calm purpose. One moment she was there, a solid figure against the deepening gloom, and the next, she was gone, absorbed by the shadows as if she had been one all along. Forrest stood alone on the bank, the cool night air raising goosebumps on his damp skin. The creek was just a creek again, the woods just woods, but everything had changed. The solitude he had so carefully cultivated felt different now. It was no longer empty, but filled with the echo of a silent encounter, the memory of two dark, curious eyes. Her name was a mystery, her purpose unknown, but her image was burned into his mind. He did not know it yet, But the quiet peace he had been seeking was over, replaced by a profound and unsettling restlessness that promised to change the course of his life forever. Her name was Silver Brook, though he would not learn it for some time, and she had just walked away with a piece of his soul. The days that followed the silent encounter at the creek were filled with a strange disquiet for Forrest. His well-ordered solitude, once a comfort, now felt like a hollow echo. He found his gaze drifting to the opposite bank, searching the shadows of the junipers and cottonwoods for a glimpse of the woman with the watchful eyes. But she was gone. The wilderness had swallowed her whole, leaving him to wonder if he had imagined the entire event, a fever dream born of loneliness and the hypnotic shimmer of the setting sun on water. Yet the memory was too vivid, too real. It clung to him like the scent of sage after a rain. He worked his land with a renewed vigor, trying to sweat the restlessness out of his system, but every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of anticipation through him. He was a man adrift, caught in the current of a river whose destination he could not guess. It was nearly a week later when the sky turned against him. He was in the far western pasture, a rugged stretch of land where the earth crumbled into a series of deep, rocky arroyos. A section of fence had been brought down by a rock slide, and he'd spent the better part of the afternoon clearing debris and setting new posts, his sweat mingling with the dust. The clouds had rolled in from the north, silent and grey at first, then darkening to a bruised purple, the color of a gathering storm. He'd seen storms like this before. They could unleash their fury with terrifying speed. He was wrestling the last post into the ground when the first crack of thunder split the sky. His horse, a steady gelding named Apache, shied violently, its eyes wide with panic. "Easy now, boy, easy," Forrest soothed, grabbing for the reins. But the next clap of thunder was directly overhead, a deafening explosion of sound. Patches reared, tearing the reins from Forrest's grasp, and bolted. "Patches!" Forrest yelled into the rising wind, but the horse was a brown blur disappearing into the storm. Cursing, Forrest turned to make the long trek back to the cabin on foot. The rain began then, not a drizzle, but a sudden, blinding deluge, turning the dry ground into a slick, treacherous mud. He scrambled to find a safer path along the rim of the arroyo, his boots slipping on the wet rock. That was his last clear thought. His foot slid out from under him, his arms flailed for a hold that wasn't there, and for a heart-stopping moment, he was airborne. He hit the side of the gully with a sickening crunch, tumbling down the rocky incline, his head striking a sharp outcrop of granite before he landed in a heap at the bottom. Pain, white-hot and absolute, shot up from his left leg. Then the world dissolved into a swirling, roaring darkness. He drifted in and out of consciousness, a prisoner of pain and fevered dreams. Time lost all meaning. He was vaguely aware of the rain lashing his face, of the cold seeping deep into his bones. At one point, he managed to drag himself under a small overhang of rock, a pathetic attempt at shelter. He knew, with a chilling certainty that cut through the delirium, that this was how men died out here. Alone, broken at the bottom of a ditch, their passing marked only by the circling buzzards. He was lost in a grey fog when a touch brought him back. It was a gentle, hesitant pressure on his cheek. He forced his heavy eyelids open. A face swam into focus above him, blurred by the rain and his own failing senses. It was her, the woman from the creek. Her long black hair was plastered to her skin, and her doeskin dress was soaked through. But her eyes were just as he remembered them, dark, clear, and filled with an unnerving calm. She said something in her own tongue, the words soft and fluid, like the running water nearby. He couldn't understand them, but the tone was one of assessment, not alarm. Forrest tried to speak, but only a hoarse groan escaped his lips. He tried to push himself up, but the movement sent a fresh wave of agony through his leg, and he fell back, his teeth gritted. Her hand moved from his cheek to his forehead, her skin cool against his feverish flesh. She saw the gash on his temple, the unnatural angle of his leg. Her expression remained serene, but a new resolve hardened her features. She disappeared for a moment and returned with a piece of his own torn shirt, which she gently used to clean the mud and blood from the wound on his head. Her movements were economical and precise. She was not panicking, she was working. He watched through a haze of pain as she set about saving his life. She gathered broad leaves from a hardy desert plant and, using a strip of her own buckskin, fashioned a makeshift vessel to collect rainwater that was trickling down a clean rock face. She brought it to his lips, and he drank greedily. The water was a balm to his parched throat. Her name, he would learn later, was Silver Brook, and she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the rhythms of this land, its cruelty and its bounty. She found a specific type of feathery-leafed plant yarrow and crushed the leaves between two stones, creating a poultice that she carefully applied to his head wound. The bleeding, which had been sluggish but steady, soon slowed to a stop. The hardest part came next. She looked from his leg to his eyes, and he saw the message there as clearly as if she had spoken it in English. Asterisk. This will hurt. Asterisk. He gave a weak, consenting nod. He was at her mercy. He knew it, and she knew it. With a strength that belied her slender frame, she braced his leg. She placed one hand on his ankle and the other just below his knee. She looked into his eyes one last time, a silent command to be ready, and then, with a swift, powerful pull, she set the bone. Forrest screamed, a raw, animal sound that was swallowed by the gully. Black spots danced in his vision, and he nearly passed out again, but her voice, a low, steady murmur, anchored him to consciousness. She worked tirelessly. She found straight, sturdy branches and tore more strips from his shirt to fashion a crude but effective splint, immobilizing the leg. As the fever took hold, he began to shiver violently. Without hesitation, she removed the dry blanket roll she carried on her back and wrapped it tightly around him. For 2 days, she did not leave his side. She built a small, smokeless fire in the shelter of the overhang, its warmth a precious gift against the lingering chill. She found roots to roast and gathered more herbs, brewing a bitter tea from willow bark that eased the fever and dulled the relentless throbbing in his leg. She spoke to him sometimes in her soft Apache dialect, not as if expecting an answer, but simply to fill the silence, to let him know he was not alone. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Forrest woke to find the world clear and sharp for the first time since the fall. The sun was shining, and Silver Brook was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in a moccasin with a bone needle. She looked up and saw he was awake and lucid. He cleared his throat, his voice a dry rasp. "Thank you," he managed. She simply inclined her head, her expression unreadable. She offered him a piece of roasted root, and he ate it, the simple food tasting better than any meal he could remember. An awkward but necessary silence stretched between them. They were two people from warring cultures, bound together by fate in a rocky ditch. He was a man who had built his life on self-reliance, now utterly dependent on her. She was a woman who had every reason to fear or hate him, yet she had shown him nothing but profound, life-saving kindness. He pointed to himself. "Forrest," he said, his voice still weak. She watched his lips, then repeated the word, her pronunciation soft and accented, yet clear. "Forrest." Then she pointed to herself, a single, elegant gesture. "Sonora protida," she said. She then pointed to the small trickle of water running through the bottom of the arroyo, its surface glinting in the sun. "Silver Brook," he understood. "Silver Brook," he repeated. A small, weak smile touched his lips. It was a beautiful name. It suited her. She acknowledged it with a slight nod, The first brick in the bridge between their worlds had been laid. Over the next few days it grew stronger. He learned that a nod and a gesture could convey more than a paragraph of polite words. He learned that her silence was not one of emptiness, but of observation. She learned that his grunts of pain were not of anger, but of endurance. She would bring him water, and he would mouth thank you. He would watch her gather herbs, her movements a graceful dance with the earth, and a deep, humbling respect grew in his heart. The stereotypes he had unconsciously carried, the savage, the primitive, crumbled away, replaced by the image of a skilled, intelligent, and deeply compassionate woman. He didn't know why she was helping him. Perhaps it was simple human decency, a quality that knew no language or color. Or perhaps, in that silent meeting at the creek, she had seen something in him, not a white intruder, but simply a man as lonely and scarred as the land itself. Whatever the reason, as he lay there, broken and helpless, Forrest knew one thing for certain. He owed his life to the Apache woman named Silver Brook, and that debt was forging a bond stronger and more profound than he could ever have imagined. Getting Forrest out of the arroyo was an ordeal that tested the limits of Silver Brook's ingenuity and his own pain-racked endurance. After a week of her care, his fever was gone, and some strength had returned to his upper body, but his splintered leg was a useless, agonizing anchor. It was clear he couldn't make it back to the cabin on his own. Silver Brook left him one morning with a supply of water and roasted roots, making a series of gestures, walking, a horse, returning, that he slowly deciphered. She was going for help, his help. Hours later she returned, not with patches, but leading the placid gelding herself. The horse, having grazed his fill after the storm, had evidently been easy enough for her to find and gentle. Getting Forrest onto its back was a slow, torturous process that left him pale and drenched in a cold sweat, every jostle sending shards of pain through his leg. Silver Brook led the horse with a steady hand, choosing the flattest, easiest path back to the cabin, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead. The sight of his simple cabin felt like a homecoming. Inside, Silver Brook helped him onto his cart, her touch firm but gentle, and immediately set about making the space more suitable for a convalescent. She built a fire in the hearth, found his spare blankets, and explored his meager pantry, her expression a mixture of curiosity and mild disapproval at the contents, mostly flour, beans, and salted meat. Forrest, propped up against the wall, watched her. The cabin, his solitary sanctuary, was now shared. Her presence filled it, changing its very nature. The air was no longer still, but carried the faint, pleasant scent of the herbs she carried in a small leather pouch at her belt. The silence was no longer empty, but punctuated by the soft scrape of her moccasins on the wooden floor, and the low hum of a song she sometimes sang under her breath as she worked. During the long days of his recovery, their unique language of gestures and single words deepened. He learned the Apache words for water *, tall, fire, K, and pain, and she, in turn, began to pick up English with remarkable speed, pointing to objects and repeating the words he gave her * table, cup, blanket, *. Her voice, when she spoke his language, was soft and melodic, sanding the hard edges off the English consonants. This fragile piece, however, was not destined to last. It was an island in a vast sea of ingrained prejudice, and the tide was beginning to turn. Within Silver Brook's own tribe, her prolonged absence had not gone unnoticed. She was the daughter of a respected elder, and her skills as a healer were well known, but her association with the white man, who had settled so near their ancestral lands, was a source of growing concern. The most vocal of her critics was a warrior named Weah. He was strong, proud, and bore the scars, both physical and emotional, of past conflicts with settlers and the army. He saw every white man as a harbinger of broken treaties and stolen land. One afternoon, Weah appeared at the edge of the clearing that surrounded Forrest's cabin. He did not approach, but stood by the tree line, a silent, imposing figure with a stone-tipped lance in his hand. Silver Brook was outside, tending to a small herb garden she had started near the cabin door. She saw him, and her body stiffened. She went to meet him, their conversation low and urgent, spoken in the rapid cadence of their native tongue. Forrest watched from the open doorway, unable to understand the words, but reading the tension in their bodies. Weah's posture was rigid, his jaw set. He gestured angrily toward the cabin, then toward the land beyond. Silver Brook's replies were calm but firm, her hands moving to emphasize her points, her head held high. Weah saw Forrest, and his eyes, dark and hard as obsidian, narrowed with a look of pure, undiluted contempt. He clearly viewed Silver Brook's actions as a betrayal, a dangerous flirtation with the enemy. After a final, sharp exchange, Weah turned and melted back into the forest, but his disapproval lingered in the air like a coming storm. When Silver Brook returned to the cabin, the serene mask she usually wore had slipped. Forrest saw the worry in her eyes. "He is Weah," she said, her English still hesitant. "He, not trust." "I can see that," Forrest replied grimly. "He thinks I will bring harm to you, to your people." She simply nodded, a troubled look on her face. "He remembers much pain." The threat was not confined to one side. Forrest's ranch was small, but he employed one other hand, a drifter named Chester, who came and went as he pleased. Chester was a man whose soul had been pickled in whiskey and bitterness. He was thin and weaselly, with shifty eyes and a perpetual sneer. He'd been away on a week-long binge in the nearest town, and returned to find a situation that his narrow mind could only process in one way. He rode into the yard, and his eyes widened when he saw Silver Brook helping Forrest redress the bandage on his leg. He dismounted, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into ugly suspicion. "What in blazes is this, Forrest?" he spat, his gaze raking over Silver Brook as if she were a piece of livestock. "You letting a squaw tend to you? Have you lost your mind?" "That's enough, Chester," Forrest said, his voice low and dangerous. "She saved my life. Her name is Silver Brook. You'll show her respect." Chester let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Respect? For an Apache? They're thieves and savages, all of them. She's probably just waiting for the right moment to slit your throat and take whatever you got." He took a step toward her, his hand dropping to the hilt of the knife on his belt. "You best get on back to wherever you came from, girl, before there's trouble." Instantly, Silver Brook was on her feet, her body poised with the lethal grace of a cornered cat. The gentle healer was gone, replaced by a woman who had been raised in a world where survival was a daily battle. Her hand flew to the small skinning knife she wore, her dark eyes flashing with a fire that made Chester take an involuntary step back. "I said, that's enough," Forrest roared, struggling to push himself up. The effort sent a jolt of pain through his leg, but his voice cracked like a whip. "She's under my protection, Chester. You lay one hand on her, you even look at her wrong again, and you'll be answering to me. Now get out of this cabin." Chester stared, momentarily stunned by the ferocity in Forrest's voice. He looked from Forrest's determined face to Silver Brook's defiant one. A sly, venomous look crossed his features. He backed away, his hands raised in mock surrender. "All right, boss, all right," he sneered. "If you want to play house with a redskin, that's your business. But don't come crying to me when her brothers show up to lift your scalp." He turned and stalked off toward the bunkhouse, muttering under his breath. The confrontation left a poison in the air. The simple, healing world they had built inside the cabin walls had been breached. Forrest knew Chester's type. He wouldn't let this go. A man like that fed on grievance and prejudice. He would take his story to town, twist it, embellish it, and paint Silver Brook as a seductress or a spy. He would stoke the fears and hatreds that always simmered just beneath the surface of frontier life. Forrest looked at Silver Brook. The fire was gone from her eyes, replaced once again by that deep, watchful calm, but he saw the new line of tension around her mouth. They were caught between two worlds, both of which were closing in on them. Weir's distrust and Chester's hatred were two sides of the same tarnished coin. "He will make trouble," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," Forrest said, his heart heavy. "He will." Their bond had been forged in the quiet isolation of the arroyo, a bridge of healing built on mutual need and respect. Now, that bridge had to withstand the storm of a world that did not understand and did not want to. The shadows of distrust were gathering, and Forrest feared they were long and dark enough to swallow the small light they had found in each other. Chester's malice, once planted, grew like a thorny weed in the sun-scorched soil of frontier prejudice. As Forrest had feared, the man rode to the nearby settlement of Redemption and spun a venomous tale. He spoke of the Apache woman who had bewitched Forrest, painting her not as a healer, but as a cunning spy who had infiltrated the ranch. He whispered of strange comings and goings in the night, of shadowy figures seen near the cattle pens. It was a story designed to prey on old fears, to ignite the simmering resentment that many settlers felt toward the native tribes whose land they now occupied. The poison found fertile ground. A few days later, a prize calf from Forrest's own small herd went missing. It was Chester, of course, who had done the deed in the dead of night, driving the animal into a remote box canyon and then doubling back, careful to leave a trail of muddled tracks leading vaguely in the direction of the Apache encampment. He then discovered the loss at dawn, riding into Redemption with a face contorted in righteous fury. "It's the Apache," he declared to the men gathered in the saloon. "Just like I warned. They're getting bold. That squaw at Forrest's place, she was the scout. They're testing us, seeing what they can get away with. We don't put a stop to this now, we'll all be losing stock." His words were the spark on dry tinder. A posse of a half-dozen angry, self-righteous men was formed within the hour, their judgment clouded by whiskey and long-held hatred. They weren't interested in proof. They were interested in a show of force. Back at the cabin, an uneasy quiet had settled. Forrest's leg was healing well, the bone knitting with a dull ache, and he could now walk with the aid of a crude crutch he'd fashioned from a sturdy branch. He and Silver Brook knew something was wrong. The air itself felt heavy, charged with a tension that made the birds fall silent. She was teaching him how to grind juniper berries into a fragrant powder when they heard it, the distant thunder of approaching hooves. Forrest pulled himself up, his face grim. "Get inside," he told her, his voice low. "No," she said, her chin lifting in defiance. "I will stand with you." He looked at her, saw the unshakable resolve in her dark eyes, and nodded. This was not his fight to shelter her from. It was their fight to face together. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door, not as a threat, but as a statement that he would not be easily intimidated. The riders burst into the clearing led by Chester, his face flushed with a malevolent triumph. They pulled their horses up in a churning cloud of dust, their expressions hard and unforgiving. Forrest, the leader, a burly blacksmith named Grover, shouted, "We know what's been going on," Chester told us. "Your Apache whore has been helping her people steal from you, from all of us." Forrest stood in the doorway, the rifle held loosely in one hand, his weight resting on the crutch. Silver Brook was a silent, poised presence just behind his shoulder. "You're mistaken, Grover," Forrest said, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the angry murmurs. "There's been no thieving, "And you will not speak of this woman that way." Chester laughed, a high, ugly sound. "Don't listen to him. He's besotted. Look at him, protecting her. We found the tracks, plain as day, heading right for their camp. They took his calf, and we're here to get it back. And some justice besides." The situation was escalating, the men shifting in their saddles, their hands moving toward their sidearms. At that precise moment, a new element entered the standoff. From the trees at the edge of the clearing, 3 figures emerged on foot. It was Rhea, followed by 2 other Apache warriors. They were armed with bows and lances, their faces painted for a fight they had not sought, but were clearly prepared for. Rhea's eyes took in the scene. The armed white men, Forrest and Silver Brook standing together, and his expression hardened into a granite mask. He had followed Chester's trail, sensing the trouble the man was stirring. The clearing was now a powder keg. 2 worlds stood poised on the brink of violence, with Forrest and Silver Brook trapped in the deadly space between. "See, there they are," Chester crowed. "The rest of the Thevin party." Forrest knew he had only seconds before a shot was fired and blood was spilled. He had to extinguish the fuse. He ignored the mob and fixed his gaze on Chester, his voice dropping, yet carrying with absolute authority. "You're a liar, Chester," he said, the words sharp as flint. "What did you call me?" Chester blustered, his hand tightening on his pistol. "I said you're a liar," Forrest repeated, taking a painful step forward, leaning on his crutch. "You told them that tracks led toward the Apache camp, didn't you? But the camp is to the east, across the river. My west pasture, where the calf was taken, is bordered by the red canyons. Any tracks leading from there would go west into impassable terrain." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Grover's face. He knew the lay of the land. "And another thing," Forrest continued, pressing his advantage. "You said they took the calf." "More than one man, but I went out there this morning when I saw it was gone." The tracks weren't from Apache moccasins. They were from a single horse, and the boot prints beside them were worn down at the heel, just like those cheap town boots you're so proud of. He pointed his crutch directly at Chester's footwear. Every eye swung to Chester's boots. The man's face went pale. That don't prove nothin'," he stammered, "doesn't it?" Forrest's voice was relentless. "And what about Patches, my horse? He came back to the barn late last night, long after I'd turned him out. He was sweaty and lathered, as if he'd been ridden hard, almost as if someone had used him to drive a calf into a canyon and then ridden him back in a hurry." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Chester's bluster crumbled, replaced by the corner-drat panic of a man whose lies had unraveled. The members of the posse looked at each other, then at Chester, their angry certainty dissolving into suspicion. They had been led here by a liar. Grover's face darkened with shame and anger. "Is this true, Chester? Did you lie to us?" Chester, seeing the tide turn against him, made a fatal mistake. He drew his pistol, his eyes wild with desperation, and aimed it at Forrest. "He's the liar, him and his savage pet." He never fired. An arrow, impossibly fast, whistled through the air and embedded itself in the wooden stock of Chester's pistol. The impact slammed the gun from his hand. Everyone stared, stunned, at Rhea, who stood with his bow still raised. Another arrow already knocked on the string. We had not aimed to kill, but to disarm. It was an act of tactical brilliance, a demonstration of lethal skill used with incredible restraint. The standoff was over. Chester, disarmed and exposed, broke. He scrambled for his fallen pistol, but Grover was faster, kicking it away. "Get out of here, Chester," the blacksmith growled, his voice thick with disgust. "Don't ever let me see your face in redemption again." Chester gave one last look of pure hatred at Forrest and Silver Brook, then turned and fled into the woods on foot, a disgraced and pathetic figure. The rest of the posse, humbled and ashamed, slowly turned their horses and rode away without another word. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by the chirping of a cricket. Forrest stood, leaning heavily on his crutch, the adrenaline draining away, leaving him trembling. Silver Brook's hand found his arm, her touch a steadying anchor in the sudden calm. Weir and his companions lowered their weapons. He walked forward slowly, stopping a few feet from Forrest. His gaze was no longer filled with contempt. He looked at Forrest, then at Silver Brook's hand on his arm, and then back to Forrest. He had witnessed a white man risk his own life, not only to protect an Apache woman, but to defend the honor of her people with truth. He had seen a man choose words over bullets and courage over prejudice. Weir gave a single sharp nod. It was a gesture of profound, hard-won respect. Forrest, understanding its weight, returned the nod. A bridge had not just been built, it had been crossed. The story ended as it had begun, at the creek. Weeks later, Forrest's leg was fully healed, leaving him with only a slight limp as a reminder of his ordeal. He and Silver Brook stood on the bank, the late afternoon sun warming their faces. This time, they were on the same side of the water, standing so close, their shoulders touched. He reached down and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. The connection was no longer unspoken or uncertain. It was a solid, tangible thing, forged in silence, tempered in crisis, and strengthened by a love that had defied every barrier placed in its way. "Sonora Protida," he said, speaking her name softly. "Silver Brook." She looked up at him, her dark eyes holding the reflection of the vast, open sky. "Forrest," she replied, her voice filled with a quiet certainty that matched his own. The creek flowed on, its current steady and eternal, washing away the last shadows of distrust and carrying them toward a shared horizon. They did not know what challenges the future held, but they knew they would face them together. On the banks of a simple creek, in the heart of a harsh and unforgiving land, two different souls had found their common ground, creating a current of acceptance strong enough to change their world forever. True connection is not defined by culture or language, but is forged in the crucible of compassion. It teaches us that courage is not about facing an enemy, but about defending the truth, and that the strongest bridges are built over the deepest divides with respect and understanding. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confer your subscription and leave a like. It helps us out a lot.